Is there a such thing as a G spot?
We as adults, the further out we get from childhood, we lose that sense of play, that sense of wonder, that sense of imagination.
But I feel like our concepts of sex in our culture have shifted, and that there is sort of this concept of a goal or an end point, or, you know, we lose that opportunity for play and creativity.
It's all about you defining what brings you pleasure, and it's going to look different for everyone. So let's go more in depth about priming the pleasure pump.
You know, I was just talking to somebody about this a couple of days ago. We were talking specifically about fantasies and desires and eroticism, and how that's so difficult for adults. And I know it sounds unrelated to our pleasure pump, but I'm going to get there in a second. But what I was kind of reflecting on with this other person was that children are so imaginative, and they do a lot of imaginative play, and they kind of just find joy even in the simplest things. I mean, you could stick a kid in a yard, and they'll find rocks and sticks and sand and dirt and stuff to play in. And so they're finding, really what they're doing is they're finding pleasure, even in their just little environment, and just kind of creating it. And we as adults, the further out we get from childhood, we lose that sense of play, that sense of wonder, that sense of imagination. And so I find that, especially with my older clients, 50s, 60s, 70s, again, going back to that stress piece, trauma piece, stress of a job, a career, as you age, usually you're going kind of up in your career. And so as things become more, lack of a better phrase, more serious, the further out we get from that imaginative play, pleasure, kind of like our birthright almost, our birthright to pleasure and enjoyment. And so when I'm talking to people about priming their pleasure pump, they're just like, so I have to masturbate at 7 a.m. And I'm like, no, the simplest things, again, drinking coffee on the porch. And so what I will usually have people do or think about, and again, this is actually a mindfulness technique, is to write down a list of things that you find pleasurable. They could be sexual if you want them to be, sexual, non-sexual, but write a list of things that you find pleasurable. And then every hour that you are awake, do one of those things. And it could be 5 seconds, it could be 10 minutes, but do one of those things, because if we are not finding pleasure throughout our day, it's really hard to kind of make yourself find pleasure in the bedroom at night. And when you explain it and kind of break it down to that, like that, it seems to make sense for people, but we don't ever think of it like this. Like I tell, especially like women that I work with, you've been stressed all day, either taking care of your family, taking care of your kids, working, doing all the things. Like, how are you supposed to unwind and find pleasure in the evening? I mean, sometimes you can, and some people do, and there's nothing wrong with that either. But really, throughout the day is kind of when you need to have this idea of what I call priming your pleasure pump.
And also, I want to sort of circle back and highlight something that I think is really important that you mentioned, Christina, in terms of like childhood play and pleasure, and sort of how that all works together. Because especially, well, when we're looking at children and they're out playing in the yard with their sticks and rocks, there's very rarely a goal or an end point. Like, this play has a purpose. When we get to the end of this play, we will have some, X, Y, Z. But I feel like our concepts of sex in our culture have shifted, and that there is sort of this concept of a goal or an end point, or, we lose that opportunity for play and creativity and just pleasure and enjoyment when we frame it in terms of, there has to be an orgasm or there has to be an erection. We can kind of blow past the joy of pleasure if we're kind of looking for this goal, and so I think it's really liberating to think about it, like you mentioned, in terms of having an opportunity for play in our lives that doesn't have to have a purpose or a goal. We don't have to be productive. We don't have to check something off. We can just simply be and feel good, no matter how that looks or what it looks like. And it really sort of opens up the opportunities for what that can include. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because I think that's one of the premises about pleasure that we haven't mentioned yet, in that there does not necessarily have to be a goal, which again, as we age and get older and just be productive members of society, that sounds so foreign to us. I mean, when where else in our day or in our routine is there an opportunity that we don't have a goal, you know? But I think that's what's so liberating and freeing about trying to live a pleasure-filled life. And really why I'm so passionate about sexuality is because there doesn't have to be a goal. It's fluid. Everybody can define it for themselves. And so that's like so freeing, right? In like a society where we have to go, be, do, that sexuality is not like that.
Especially when we're thinking in terms of pleasure, because a lot of folks I work with get sort of surprised or ashamed or uncertain when they find pleasure. And so I think bringing a non-judgmental sense of mindfulness, or even noting. Sometimes I have people imagine sort of like a sticky note, like when you notice a feeling or when you find something that you enjoy, just sort of attach a note to it, like, oh, that feels good. That's a rough touch. I like that. Doesn't You don't have to say, oh gosh, should I like that? That's not what I'm supposed to like. But just sort of non-judgmentally noting what feels good in the body, and then moving on. Like, you don't have to decide whether or not it's okay. Just decide what feels good to you. We can unpack that later, but it kind of gives you the mindfulness awareness of pleasure without having to judge whether or not you deserve that pleasure. Because here's the punchline: you do.
Exactly. That kind of leads us into talking a little bit about pleasure mapping. So I think at least I have talked a lot about pleasure, why it's important, why I think everybody's deserving of pleasure. But, that brings into the concept of pleasure mapping. Like, how do we figure out what is pleasurable?
I guess for me personally, it's taking the time out to learn about myself. And that's challenging for a lot of us, is really taking that time to see, because like it's already been mentioned, we have goals in mind and all the other things going on in life that we then kind of say, like, I don't even have time to figure out what I like. But so for me personally, I have to make time to figure out what brings me pleasure and what that looks like.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of different people, that process looks like a lot of different things. Some people need to just write it down, kind of just like loosely journal. Sometimes I'll give people like literally just like a body, like a map of their body. It's just an outline of their body, front and back, and kind of just circle the areas you're curious about, circle the areas that you already know give you pleasure, put an X on the areas that are absolutely off limits. And that's not just a practice for yourself, but also for your partner, partners, whoever else that you choose to share that with. But sometimes some people need more of a fluid conversation with like another professional, sex positive professional. Some people need like just concrete, written down, concrete drawing. And so helping people understand how to map out their pleasure, and then also understanding that it doesn't necessarily need to be, again, goal focused, genital oriented areas of pleasure. There's plenty of other pleasurable areas on the human body. Some of them that we think of, such as like breast, but all the other areas include like stomach, navel, behind the ears, even your lips. So kissing, things like that. Arm, sometimes it's just like the need for touch in a non-sexual way. That can still be pleasure, and that's still part of your pleasure mapping.
And I think it's also helpful for folks to open up their touch to receive on those places too, because some folks might enjoy like a really light sort of tickling touch, and other folks might find, I'm going to X that off on the map, but I like a real firm pressure touch at that spot, or different rates of speed of touch, or things like that. And that's when using assistive devices can be also helpful and come into play in terms of pleasure mapping. So some folks find with or without a partner using different tools to be really helpful, whether it's a type of vibrator or other device. You can kind of access that and on different parts of the body and in different ways too. So I learned a new term, vibe therapy, which I love. That's including using something that has vibration, because vibration in the body increases circulation and blood flow and increases arousal, especially at the genitals. And so using a vibrator around the areas of the vulva or the clitoris, or even the anus or other parts of the body, the perineum, can increase blood flow and arousal and increase pleasurable sensations when other types of stimulation might not be able to recreate that. I think that it can be useful to think about using a vibrator like we would another, useful tool in our life. So for instance, I feel silly now. Now I don't know if I can say it.
You can.
Okay. So for instance, using a dishwasher at your house. Like, you can wash your dishes without a dishwasher, and you can have pleasure or even orgasm without a vibrator. But sometimes a dishwasher gets those dishes done a little bit faster and a little bit more completely. And just it can help liberate your life in other ways, right? And so using a vibrator, if you have trouble sort of cognitively thinking about like, oh, I don't know. I'm not sure if a vibrator or vibe therapy is proper for me. You can just imagine it as any other device you would use in your life to improve things and try something new. So using assistive devices, tools, or toys is completely healthy, normal, welcome. And there's really nothing that's off the table when you're considering your own pleasure, as long as it feels good to you and it's consensual with you and any other partner or partners you might be with. So when you're exploring your pleasure and your pleasure map, your hands are great tools, and there's really an unlimited amount of other tools on the table. So, and we also hope that you'll come join us at Adam and Eve store to explore the array of inventory that's available for pleasure mapping and enjoyment.
I love that analogy to the dishwasher, because actually the vibrator was one of the first household appliances. So
I believe it. The big wand one with the
yes. But really, I don't know this for sure. I need to fact check myself, but I think it predates the dishwasher. So it was one of the first household appliances. So it's been around for a long time, but again, it's still taboo to talk about. A lot of people still feel uncomfortable, maybe shame. But again, also we can go into the nuances of this too, but how people don't feel the right or like they deserve pleasure, which I think, Cole, you touched on at the very beginning of this talk, was that everybody's deserving of pleasure. And the nice thing is that you get to define what that looks like for yourself.
All right, so let's bust a myth around the G-spot. Is there a such thing as a G-spot, and where did that term come from?
So the G-spot was defined by a male physician, I believe. I'm not even going to try to say his last name, but basically it starts with a G. So this spot was named after a male who discovered this area. He thought that there was some sort of role of the urethra, which is the little short, in females, the little short small tube that drains the bladder to the outside of the body. He felt that there was some role the urethra played in female pleasure. And so he termed this area the G-spot. It's about a third to halfway up the vagina on the front side, or in medical terms, the anterior wall of the vagina. And so what I find is that people will be searching for this area like it's a magic golden area. They need to find it, they need to press it, they need to stimulate it, because that is how their lady is going to orgasm. But really, it has an even more interesting history, because we talk a lot about the G-spot, but we don't talk about Cherie Height, who was a feminist in the 70s, who sent out a survey to about 3,000 women, because she wanted to also demonstrate that women received pleasure not through penetration of the vagina, but through outside stimulation of the vulva, especially the clitoris. And so she got this survey results back, and she published them in what she called what's labeled the Height Report, HITE. And in this book is just really all of her research and survey results. And what it showed is that only 4% of women will actually orgasm from penetration alone. That by and large, most women need some sort of external stimulation of the vulva. Usually that's right at the clitoris. And so she published this back in 1976. And then in the 1980s sometimes is when this man published reports about the G-spot. And so it seemed to be that we were going back to try to say, no, women did need penetration in order to orgasm. And it was felt that if you orgasmed from clitoral stimulation alone, that you were sexually immature. And I mean, this was just,
I gotta say that
40 years ago.
I hear this like multiple times a week, and women saying, well, no, I don't orgasm, except for when it's with the clitoral stimulation. I'm like, that counts too.
Right.
That was a really strong myth that persists so deeply today. And it's such a shame because it really decreases one's perception of their pleasure. Like, no, this pleasure doesn't count because it's not penetration. So this is I'm glad this is the only myth we're busting, because it's a big one.
It is a big one. And it goes back to saying, like, you and I still both see women today, this week, that are trying to find the G-spot. And I think, and I mean, you even see it like in Cosmopolitan magazine. I mean, it's like it makes the front page, like trying to find the G-spot. And we have found, and kind of like feminist theory finds, that when we glamorize finding the G-spot, it's society's way of distracting from the pleasure aspect of the clitoris, which is really the woman's way to empower her to define her own sexuality. So it's saying, like, you should feel pleasure because of XYZ, when really pleasure and sexuality is, we try to define it as a social construct, but really it's for the individual to define. Like, there's really nobody else that can tell you what is or is not pleasurable. Like, that is for you to define. And I say all that to say, not that I'm a G-spot hater, but if you find that particular area pleasurable, like, by all means, go for it. I'm also not telling you that you can't find that area inside the vagina pleasurable. Like, but I think that it's really important to note that most women, by and large, the majority of women, need clitoral stimulation in order to reach an orgasm. And so again, pleasure is yours to define, but we're just here giving you the facts.
I think so many people can break free just by hearing this alone, men and women, because men pressure themselves to be, man, I didn't find her spot. And women think because this said spot may not have been felt, that there's something wrong with them, or I gotta keep trying and trying, and it's all this pressure and everything else. But it's like what both of you have said, it's all about you defining what brings you pleasure. And it's gonna look different for everyone. So there's no one defined way of how everyone should receive pleasure. So
right.
If we're considering back to our initial definition of pleasure as a physical and or emotional experience, it's helpful to think that the clitoris or these other erogenous zones on the body aren't necessarily kind of you can just push and there's pleasure. So it's not, and like we said too, it's not just physical. We can't just wiggle around the clitoris and end up at the most amazing orgasm there ever was. But it also kind of, pleasure takes place in context of the rest of our body, the experience, who we're with or by ourselves, what sort of mood we're in, what's happened all around us, and the other sensations as well. What does it smell like in the room where we're experiencing pleasure? What type of surface are we on? Is there a certain taste in our body? So while the clitoris is certainly a very, very dense area of nerve endings that's designed for pleasure, it really is sort of a full body and a full mental and emotional experience as well. So that's why sometimes kind of being in the mood or not in the mood will change whether or not you're able to have an orgasm, because it's not just a button you can press.
I like that. It's definitely contextual. And, as you were talking about all of that, it reminded me that, as a PA, as a medical provider, and somebody who prescribes medications, and now that we have like some medications out there to help, especially women, we've had medications out to help men for a long time, but now that we have 2 FDA approved medications to help women with sexual dysfunction, the studies show that they can increase desire, but they don't necessarily increase pleasure. And so that's an interesting concept, that just because you're doing it doesn't necessarily mean you're getting more of a pleasure response from it, because pleasure, again, is all these things that we've been talking about, and not really goal oriented, right?
Yeah. Wow. Well, this was great. And all it does is make me more excited for our event coming up at Adam and Eve, where we will get a chance to go more in depth about a lot of the things that we have touched on so far. So I'm excited and hope you all will come out and join us for a great conversation and so much more. But thank you, ladies, for
Thank
this
you.
amazing conversation. And we'll see everyone back for week 4.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.